Thank you.
Yeah, very
Thanks
glad.
all of you.
Very, very glad to have you here. Vivian's joining us from Milton. So for those of you who don't know me, I think I've met most of you, although there are a couple faces that I don't know yet, although I do recognize everyone's name at the very least. But I'm the Canadian Church Relations Liaison for Calvin, and have been ever since the start of the pandemic, which is essentially when I began this new role, January of 2020. So I was just kind of nicely getting my feet wet when the world went awry, and my job with it. Although I'm relearning how to do it in this Zoom world, just like all of you are learning how to live in this world too. So part of my role, and I'm connecting with churches. Sort of my awkward title, as awkward as my title is, it does sort of give a sense of it does give a sense of what I do. That word liaison is key. So I really am trying to be a liaison between the seminary and Canadian churches and Canadian ministries. But part of that involves thinking about contextualization. So one of the things the seminary has asked me to do is just to think about the Canadian ministry context, and to always be bringing that back to the seminary table and saying, let's not miss important things about the Canadian context and leaders in the Canadian context, what it looks like to do ministry in Canada. And so in some ways, this webinar, because it's about contextualization really, fits my role and my calling rather well. I don't need to tell any of you that justice issues, especially issues around racial injustice and systemic racism, are on the agenda of the church right now, like almost never before. Certainly not in my own memory. It's always been a part of our calling, of course, part of the church's calling. But recent events have really drawn the church, I think, out of its complacency on some of these issues, maybe even drawn us out of our complicity in some of these issues, and helping us to think more deeply, and hopefully as a result of thinking more deeply, to respond more creatively, and with sort of the love and the grace of Christ at the forefront. The media tends to portray these issues, at least over the last year, primarily as sort of an issue of black and white, and what that looks like in the States seems to predominate a lot of the media, understandably so. But what I fear that focus does is give us sometimes a little bit of a smugness in Canada. I know I'm guilty of that at times, where we sort of feel like, oh, thank goodness that's not us, that's their issue. There's sort of smugness that we know better in Canada. But the reality, of course, when we really test our hearts on that and think about that more deeply, the reality, of course, is that racism is every bit as much a part of our culture here in Canada as it is in the US. It might look different here, and in fact, often does look different here. It might be more subtle, less overt here, but it's certainly no less invasive here. And so that sort of brought us to today, and the idea of the webinar for today, for us to think about some of these issues that have been brought to the forefront again, to think about them in the Canadian context and what it looks like here, and particularly in terms of what it looks like here in our relations with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Prime purpose of our session today is really just kind of some awareness raising. I think that's kind of Shannon's goal and my goal, is as we talked about today, but also to at least begin the conversation about ministry. And so as our awareness grows, to also begin thinking about, so what does it look like as a ministry leader, one who's already engaged in ministry in Canada, as most of you are, and is preparing for further ministry, for vocational ministry. What does ministry in that kind of context look like, where these kinds of issues are so real and so ingrained in our culture? I've served 3 congregations over the 25 years that I've been a pastor in the CRC. One of them in Burlington with Ben. Ben was one of my praise team leaders. He and I did a lot of work together. And but you know, I have to say, especially over the last year, as I've become more aware of these issues, I have to say I've done very little intentionally or consciously to move the needle on some of these issues and to address them from the context of local ministry. And even here in Peterborough, where there are 3 First Nation communities close by, even here, which is the last minute congregation that I served, very little in the way of local ministry that was intentional and that was conscious. And I know your ministry is going to be different. Your ministry has to be different. We can't allow these issues, now that they've been placed on our agenda once again, to let the moment slip by unnoticed without making it part of the rhythm of the local church and part of our calling and part of our intentional ministry. So I invited Shannon Shannon Perez to lead our conversation today. Welcome, Shannon. We're so glad that you're here. My role has brought me into contact with Shannon, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 times over the last year, and I've really come to respect her and trust her as a ministry leader, and serving in so many critical ways in our denomination. She is, I was asking her to help me with this pronunciation, so if I'm wrong, like I was with Rorda, if I'm wrong, she's going to have to correct me as gently and as graciously as Darren did. But Saisi, she is Saisi Dene, First Nation. She's nodding. Yes, that's good. From Winnipeg, and married to Juan. They have 3 children. Some of you know her as the Justice and Reconciliation Mobilizer for CRCNA in Canada. And that's a role that she served in for a number of years, but more recently, she's added yet another title to that role. She's now the co-director at the Indigenous Family Center in Winnipeg as well. In just a moment, I'm gonna put in the chat a link to the ministry center there, so that if at some point you wanna follow up and learn a little bit more about her ministry there, you can do that. Shannon's gonna do a fair bit of speaking and just helping us think through some of this. Probably a good idea. I think you've all done that anyways, or most of you, just to have our mics off while she's speaking. But that doesn't mean we don't want it to be interactive. It's really just for the sake of quality of sound. So, but there'll be times where she invites you to speak, or certainly at times to invite you to use the chat box as well. And so, so we do want your input. In fact, later on, we're going to break up into breakout rooms, and we'll explain what we're going to do there for about 10 minutes. And when we come back from that, the last 20 minutes or so are just going to be Q&A. So certainly ask questions of clarification as we go as well. But if there's some stuff you want to press Shannon a little deeper on, we're going to have time for that at the end as well. And then we're going to end sharp by 5. So that's what we committed to you, and we'll make sure we end by then. So Shannon, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Blessings as you lead us. Can I just pray for you as you begin and we begin together?
Sure.
Awesome. Lord, thank you for Shannon and for the ways that you are using her in so many ways in our midst. We're thankful for her life, for her gifts, for her ministry. And we pray for her now as she helps us think through these important issues. As a body, God, as a church in Canada, we've failed in so many ways to address issues of racial justice well. And as we look at this one small piece but vital piece of the puzzle, we invite you to just speak to us personally, God, because we need to be challenged personally. I know I need to be challenged personally, but speak to us too, God, as a group of leaders who are already involved in your church and are preparing to become even more deeply involved. We pray that as a leadership group as well, you would challenge us to serve your church and to serve our nation well. And so may today just be the start of a vital conversation, one that goes on throughout our ministry. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for choosing to be here. I absolutely understand that we have so much on our plate going on right now. And I really appreciate that you're taking time to spend here and hear what I have to say and share. So Sean and I came to this idea after Sean had shared with me an article that he asked me to edit indirectly. And we had a great conversation from that. And in the midst of that sharing, we talked about just back and forth, and you know how his job is liaison, my job is Indigenous ministry, and we're thinking like, how could we bridge that together? And in that conversation, noticing a gap, understanding racism in Canada. And that, from that perspective, I'm going to talk about Indigenous rights and racism from an Indigenous rights point of view, and then that impact on my life personally and my family's life. And hopefully I'll try to tie it all together, but it might seem disjointed at times with some of the stories, but I think afterwards, there'll be a fuller picture understanding of Indigenous rights, oppression, and all of that good stuff that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to do a little bit of front loading and just talking about some of the different interpretations Indigenous rights have, because that's usually a good place to start. So where I'm starting from is not really the only place to start, but I'll just give you a rundown. We could start with the Royal Proclamation in 1763. The Royal Proclamation came after the 7 Years' War. And in that proclamation from King George, you know, he said, all land is Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. So there is a recognition that nobody could just come in and negotiate land. It had to go through the Crown, not to individual settlers. Okay, that's fine, right? That was, the theory was that Indigenous people wouldn't be taken advantage of or whatnot. And then later on, the British North American Act of 1867, when that came into effect, the dealings with, I'll use Indigenous people, nations came under federal powers. So when the Constitution, like of 1867, the powers under Section 91 listed what the federal powers are, and under Section 92 listed the provincial powers. And this is where under Section 91, the federal powers, it is control of Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Just keep that in mind, control of Indians and land reserved for Indians. No longer is it a negotiation between the Crown and nations about land. Now it's control, okay? Now, shortly after Canada became a country, or a dominion, 1867, Rupert's Land, the territory of all the watersheds that flow into the Hudson's Bay Company, this land that somehow had a monopoly, an economic trade monopoly of this land, of a company, like in British, decided to sell its land to Canada in 1869. And in that time, do you think Indigenous people were consulted? No, they were not, right? It was a land transfer economic transaction that took place. And when you think about the history, like you'll learn about the Northwest Rebellion, but in terms of what language you want to use, you know, the Northwest Resistance, right? And that's when the Métis people here in my area, Winnipeg, St. Boniface, the Red River Settlement, they were seeing land surveyors from out west coming to start, you know, plotting the land that they're getting from the Hudson's Bay. And this is all done without the Métis consultation. They already had, they had their own culture, they had their own language, they had their own way of life out here on the Red River. So keep that in mind. Then Indian Act of 1876. That was a consolidation of previous laws. So there is a law of gradual act of assimilation for Indians, like of 1857. So all those laws came together and came to be the Indian Act of 1876. Just a side note, that's the year that Calvin Seminary was founded. So I have this nice little red coffee mug that says Calvin Seminary 1876. Yeah, you know, the idea that this college is founded for education and for the betterment of the individual. At the same time, 1876 is the year the Indian Act for us Indians was made into law. So examples of the Indian Act. These are examples of rights denied. So there is a law, it was law that Indians had to go to residential school. Now, you know, when you think about treaties, the treaties that were negotiated under the Royal Proclamation, right? Like, you know, there were provisions for education, but nowhere did it say that the education that had to take place under the way it happened, residential schools, right? So the residential schools, you're forced to go, you're coerced, parents were jailed or fined. First Nations people do not own the lands on reserves. So when you think about not being able to have an economy to build up your community, right? Way back there, you had to have permission to leave the reserves. Like an Indian agent had to say, I think you're allowed to go visit your cousin, or maybe you're allowed to go to that funeral, or maybe you're allowed to go to that wedding. Or you know what, maybe there's too many Indians around and you're not allowed to go. Like they had that kind of control over a person, Indian's life. And I use Indian in a sense of the Indian Act, legal term in reference to the Indian Act. It also forbid Indians in gathering politically. So, you know, the Indigenous people understood their rights, but weren't allowed to gather and go into like to advocate for themselves. It was against the law. I'm going through this really quickly. I'm sorry, like just to end the rights that we don't have. So in 1982, we have our Constitution, right? That's when that gives the transfer of authority from British to Canada to amend its own Constitution. And that happened under our Prime Minister's father when he was Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And during that time, they wanted, there's a lot of talk about the French and the English being founders and being part of the Constitution in 1982. What they didn't include was Indigenous or Aboriginal rights. At that time, it's Aboriginal rights. None of that was included. So there was a huge organization that mobilized and got Aboriginal rights into our Constitution. So under Section 35, we have what it is: the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. Yay, right? So now it's in our Constitution that our Aboriginal treaty rights are recognized and confirmed. Far different from control of Indians and lands reserved for Indians, right? But what happened is that in that 1982 Constitution, there is also sections that one of them was that the ministers had to come together and define those Aboriginal rights, and that never happened. Those Aboriginal rights that actually got into the Constitution never got defined. So what happened is that the courts had to now define Aboriginal rights. So there's a lot of cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court to talk about Aboriginal rights and define them. For example, the Calder case in 1973, that was a milestone case because that said that Aboriginal title existed at the time of the Royal Proclamation. Aboriginal title was not derived from colonial law. So that was a big win, right? But that's not that long ago, right? 48 years ago, doing the math? I see someone shake their head. Okay, good. Another case in 1987, the Delgamuukw case, further defined Aboriginal title. So when you think back in 1982, we had the Constitution that affirmed Aboriginal rights, but it took another 15 years through the courts, that system, that process, to further define Aboriginal title. Also keep in mind that the Indian Act forbid people to hire a lawyer, right, to fight for their rights until 1951. So in 1951, that's when all of this could finally go to court, right? Now, just if you want to, it's a small group, so maybe if you want to unmute and shout out the answer, what is missing from this list of defining Aboriginal rights? Who is missing from this list in defining Aboriginal rights?
Aboriginals?
Yeah. Nowhere on there is it that Indigenous people are defining their own rights, right? It had to go through court, right? The Constitution, it wasn't defined, right? The Indian Act is definitely not going to uphold our rights, right? So I wanted to actually share a quote with you, or a speech from Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indian tribe. So his speech is from when he spoke in 1879. And maybe while I'm reading the speech, maybe if you want to write down in a chat what rights you hear him asking when I'm reading it. So this is from 1879. I have heard talk and talk, but nothing is done. Good words do not last long unless they amount to something. Words do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country, now overrun by white men. Good words do not get my people a home where they could live in peace and take care of themselves. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all the broken promises. If the white man wants to live in peace with the Indian, he could live in peace. There need be no trouble. Treat all men alike. Give them the same law. Give them all an even chance to live and grow. All men were made by the same great spirit chief. They are all brothers. The earth is the mother of all people, and all people should have equal rights upon it. You might as well expect the rivers to run backward as that any man who was born a free man should be contented when penned up and denied liberty to go where he pleases. When I think of our condition, my heart is heavy. I see men of my race treated as outlaws and driven from country to country or shot down like animals. I know that my race must change. We cannot hold our own with the white men as we are. We only ask an even chance to live as other men live. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to shop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. So I'm just gonna take a look at the chat here and see what has written. So right, so asking freedom to travel, right to life, work, religious freedom, freedom of speech, economic freedom. Exactly. So those rights that he was asking for in 1879 are the rights that were being denied from the Indian Act that I was telling you about, right? Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to work from a small screen.
So Shannon, while you're finding your place, I know you wanted me to remind you just of time. So, and I said I'd do that at 4. So we're at 4 now, just so you have a sense of where we're at.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good. What else did you hear in his speech? If you were to take all of those rights that was listed in the chat, what word could you use that would describe all of that?
Universal rights.
Yeah. Self-determination is what I was thinking of. What I wanted to go from there, and that you are probably pointing towards, is a current declaration called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So what Chief Joseph spoke of in 1879, we are still trying to make happen currently in today's world. So that is just a very overview look of how Indigenous rights have been interpreted, just denied, and that has been part of law. So I wanted to share that perspective with you too, because how I'm tying it together is when I think of racism, I think of denying of rights or the oppression of rights. And, you know, when we see that in the States, like we think of the segregation and all the type of laws, that the Jim Crow laws that they have, but they were here too in Canada, right? Like you weren't allowed to vote under the Indian Act. You didn't vote until 1960 as, yeah, they weren't allowed to go to a pool hall, right? Like they weren't allowed to vote, go to a pool hall, just other stuff that controlled every aspect of your autonomy as a person. So my story. So this is all the background, and then I was born. So I was born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I am Saisi Dene First Nation from my mom's side. My dad is non-Indigenous. He was born in Newfoundland, raised in Ottawa, and then made his life here in Winnipeg. He passed away almost 20 years ago. So my mom is still alive. She was born in 1958. She was born 2 years after a forced relocation in 1956. So previously to that relocation in Manitoba, the Saisi Dene people lived traditionally on the lands that is central Manitoba, like central northern Manitoba, in the middle of it, but into Nunavut, so that territory there. And they pretty much lived that same lifestyle for millennia following the migration of the caribou. That was their sustenance that provided the clothing, shelter, food, tools, pretty much everything that was needed to make a living. You know, just like what you hear about the bison in the Central Plains area, the caribou would be for what the Saisy Dene people did. There was a Hudson's Bay post in that area at Little Duck Lake in the middle of northern Manitoba, where trade was done. You know, so they would trade fur for metal stuff, probably for cooking or for sugar and tea, that just to offset some of the stuff that you just can't get from a caribou. You know, and made their living that way. And also at that time, in the 40s, 50s, there was also a concern that the caribou were in decline. There was a photograph that someone took, and it made it to the conservationist office department there, and said, "Oh, look at all the caribou that are being killed and slaughtered." And then they saw that there was a decline. So there was a decision made that since the post is closing and the caribou were in decline, then they should move the Saisy Dene. Can you hear how a bit patriarchal that sounds, right? First of all, you know, they didn't ask if they needed to move because the post is closing, and they didn't ask if this was part of the cycle of the caribou that was taking place. They didn't ask about the harvesting considerations the Saisy Dene people took in harvesting caribou. But nope, let's just grab one of those military planes with the big belly, land it, put people on it, and then literally fly them over to Churchill. And that had devastating consequences. 1/3 of the Saisy Dene people perished unnatural deaths, so exposure, alcohol, fire, and you just got to think in terms of the time frame. It was the 60s, so you can imagine the discrimination that was going on at that time as well. So you have all of that. You have the culture shock going on. It was a really rough time. They were promised like shelter, but the Hudson's Bay froze up before they got any shelter, so they had to like live in Churchill without any means of a proper shelter. The area in Churchill is not the same as it is in their traditional area. Resources are not the same. The economy of trade is not the same. Churchill was a booming military kind of town, so already money was the form of currency, right? So you can imagine that it just was a huge shock. An example of the kind of violence that they were living with would be my grandpa, who I have never met. He was walking down the highway to go home, and he was the victim of a hit and run. His body was so badly mangled from this hit and run, and there was no justice. It wasn't a big enough concern to follow up and find out who did this to my mom's dad, right? It was just, oh, well. And that was that. My granny had to continue raising her kids under all those conditions that I listed without a partner. And so, you know, that happened. You can imagine that once alcohol was allowed, the coping mechanism for dealing all of that went to alcohol. That led to a lot of erosion in family bonds. And then you have the residential schools. Like, the relocation didn't happen in isolation of itself. It happened while residential schools was happening. It was happening while 60 Scoop was happening. So you had all of this on top of this, what was going on. So that was what my mom grew up with, and then that I was born. So my experiences is that one thing is I don't have my language to communicate, Dene, that was broken. A lot of the people during the Churchill time, you could see that there's an abrupt cutoff of teachings from the elders to the, you know, to the descendants from that time. So I don't have any of that. I don't have the language. I don't have the teachings. I was in a meeting once with a former counselor, and he was talking about the travels he does for hunting in Tuduli. It was kind of scary listening to him, how he navigated the waters and telling me like how far he had to travel. But it also saddened me because if you were to take me to where he is talking about, I would not survive. I do not have any of the teachings, resources to know that part of that traditional lifestyle. At the same time, you know, I was like, well, I can navigate the city. Like that's something like you might not be able to do, you know, so you get to know like what you did grow up with a little bit, but it's still a loss. I still feel that loss of not knowing how to do that. I graduated from university. I focused on Native studies, and there's another time that the elder there addressed me in his language. I looked at him like, are you talking to me? Like, you know, like, who are you talking to? Because I didn't know how to respond back to him. And it was not a bad feeling. Like another student spoke to him and said she doesn't know the language. And, you know, I just, that feeling of dismissed, not a feeling of, am I really an Indigenous person? Like I didn't grow up on a reservation. I grew up in a city. I don't speak the language, right? So that's one part of the impact, is also the identity. However, I do speak 3 languages. I speak French, Spanish, and English. What is the one commonality of those languages?
They're European based.
European, yeah. Let's dig that a little bit deeper.
Colonial.
Yes. Right? I speak 3 colonial languages, but not my Dene language. I couldn't talk to my grandma if she was alive. Right? A professor once told me that if we stopped speaking French in Canada, French still wouldn't be lost, because there's still another country, another birth country, so to speak, that speaks French, right? So, but if my Dene language is lost, it's extinct, like it's gone. It's all those teachings that are part of the language gone, right? So that's an impact too, that loss. Other stories, when I was 8 years old, like grade 4, I was living with my auntie and my cousin. So my mom and I went to live with them. And there were many times we woke up, my cousin and I woke up in the morning, got ready for school, left the yard to see garbage was strewn all over our yard. And my cousin of 2 years older than me had to explain what prejudice was. So that's how we would start off our day of school, with, you know, our neighbor thinking it was okay to throw garbage in our yard. Other times, this kind of impact about, you know, when you deny rights, you know, there's a bit of it's because you're not worthy to have those rights. So that's kind of where I'm going at. Another time I was in high school and my dad told me about, hey, there's a powwow. Why don't you go to it? I'm like, yeah, you know, school's out. It's a beautiful, we have beautiful sunny days in Winnipeg. It was a beautiful sunny day. And I thought, like, yeah, let's go. So I took a couple of friends of mine and said, you know, this is what we're going to do. I was really looking forward to enjoying the powwow music, the drum, the dancing, the pride that is at powwows, you know, the renewal of my spirit. But you know what? Those friends, they were so uncomfortable that they made it so obvious that we just ended up leaving. They could not appreciate the beauty that was there, or suck it up, so to speak, to like let me enjoy it a little bit, right? So I didn't feel any better afterwards after that. So those are just some stories. Other stories, when I listened to my mom about how, you know, she goes to a store and she's been asked to like empty her pockets because they want to make sure she hasn't stolen anything. There is just recently, not even 3 weeks ago, my mom was helping an elder from Churchill. She was coming in for a medical appointment, and this lady, she had a check that she needed to cash, and she was hoping to cash this check while she was in Winnipeg, so she would have cash on hand while she was in Winnipeg. My mom told me that when they went to the bank to go cash it in, that the clerk said, oh, you have to go to this bank and get it verified. So they did that. And then that bank said, oh, no, you have to go to this bank and do something else before. These are elderly women. Like Winnipeg, I said it was a beautiful city, but we also have like very lousy weather. They had, and this lady was here on medical, and they had to do all these errands just to cash a check. Seriously. I was not, how much effort does it take to cash a check, right? Like, I don't know. I was just, couldn't believe that they had to do all that work just to cash a check. So those are just some of the experiences from my mom. Other times, I remember I was working in a restaurant. I was the server, and I don't know, somehow we were all on break, or maybe our shift was just starting or something, but there's a bunch of us in the back room, and one of I don't know what the conversation was about, but there was a comment that was 200 years ago. They should just get over it. And then it struck me. I'm like, no, like at that time, my mom was 40 years old. I'm like, my mom's 40 years old. Like, that's not 200 years ago. You know, that's living memory. You know, that forced relocation, that wasn't a trail of tears that happened like 200 years ago. That was like a snow of tears, so to speak, like 40 years ago. A living memory. And, you know, I didn't feel I could speak up because what would they, I didn't have any credentials. I didn't have a university degree or anything. The cook, he was an opinionated cook of the dominant culture. Didn't want to mess with him because he just might screw you over with orders. Like there is that real power that was there. So that actually spurred me on to obtain my Native Studies degree. So I went and got a degree so I could speak up to those myths and those stereotypes. But that wasn't easy. While I was going to university, I chose to take I was studying Native Studies. There was a couple of like it almost seemed like there's two streams back then. There was like the cultural and spiritual courses, and then there was the political courses, like the Supreme Court cases and and whatnot. And I chose the political side of the Native studies, and I didn't feel comfortable taking the cultural and spiritual courses. Couple of reasons. There is a bit of an irony of learning Indigenous teachings in a Western institution. Right? I just like, really? The other part of that was here in Winnipeg, we have a lot of Cree and Ojibwe influence here in Winnipeg. Dene is further up north, so there's not a whole lot. So I was a little bit also reluctant to take courses on spirituality that were Dene, that were Cree or Ojibwe teachings, right? And then the last part of it was that there's a bit of hesitancy because I was a Christian. And should I be taking courses that are spiritual and cultural in nature? I didn't know. I did not know, so I stayed away from them. And then you're wondering, like, again, I talked about rights. What does this all have to do with rights? You know, to understand the nuance of this, you might have to understand the hesitancy. Thank you. This is recorded, so I guess hopefully Jess will be able to listen to it later. So I want to talk a little bit about residential schools. So residential schools, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the last event, and we learned a lot about what, oh, it says my connection is unstable. Can you still hear me?
You were jittering there for a minute, Shannon, but you're back. You're good and strong. So, okay. And we're about 20 after 4, so I know you want to send us into breakout rooms in about 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Okay, let me go through this fast. It'll just blow your mind. Okay, so, you know, your rights, I talked about rights. You were forced to do that. Parents were forced to send their kids to school, right? So we have the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, right? That came out of the United Nations, and that was the United Nations came out after the war, right? Like that was founded after the war because of the rights that were violated. And one of the declarations is on the rights of the child. So these are the rights of a child: the right to equality without distinction on account of race, religion, or national origin, the right to special protection of the child's physical, mental, and social development, the right to a name and a nationality, the right to adequate nutrition, housing, and medical services, the right to special education and treatment when a child is physically or mentally handicapped, the right to understanding and love by parents and society, the right to recreational activities and free education, the right to be among first to receive relief in all circumstances, the right to protection against all forms of neglect, cruelty, exploitation, the right to be brought up in a spirit of understanding, tolerance, friendship amongst peoples, and universal brotherhood. Those are the rights of the children. Those are all rights that were violated amongst the survivors of residential schools. That blew my mind when I read those rights. Just hold that thought. So those are all the rights that were violated in the survivors of the Indian residential school. Another part of that was, while all of that was taking place, Christianity was forced on them. That was the means of what was going on. Residential schools were funded by the federal government, but were managed by Christian institutions. So Christian institutions ran the Indian residential schools and imposed a religion, and by doing that, dismissed, degrade, shamed Indigenous theology. So there was a lot of shaming going into practicing your culture, your language, your spirituality, all of that. What this created was a constructed binary that an Indigenous person must choose to be either Indigenous or Christian, but not both. There are many people to judge, offer opinions. So this played out in my hesitancy to take those cultural and spiritual classes, and also made me second guess myself. Another time I was at a closing ceremony at the university, and the elder in residence was leading a procession out of the room where we were in. During that time, I was also dating Juan, my husband now, and we had talk of like marriage, right? He's Roman Catholic, and he's like, I want to be married in a church, Roman Catholic church, and to do that, you have to be Catholic, right? And I'm like, really? You want me to become a Catholic? Like, do you know what they did? Like, we had to have that conversation. Like, you want me to become a Catholic? So we had to have that discussion. So that is going on. So there's a procession out of this this closing ceremony where the elder was walking out of the room and he's holding an eagle staff. Now, if you've ever been to a Catholic service, you have the priest that leads the procession out of the service sanctuary holding a cross, right? So I didn't know what to do. Am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to follow this eagle staff? I didn't know what to do, either or, right? Do I disrespect? Am I going to go to hell? Like, these are all like split second thoughts. That is just one snapshot of all of what goes on. That makes you question who you are. So like, how does that lead into all of this? Well, there was a report that was done in the CRC 20 years ago, and you could still see, like, in that language, is this sweat lodge inherently evil, right? So it's not just Indigenous people that are faced with that identity to that binary construct I talk about, but it's also being questioned all around us, right? And that's the impact. That's part of the impact. The TRC described spiritual violence as a person is not permitted to follow his or her preferred spiritual religious tradition. A different spiritual religious path or practice is forced on a person. A person's spiritual or religious traditions, beliefs, or practices are demeaned or belittled. Or a person is made to feel shame for practicing his or her traditional family beliefs. So all of that is, when you're doing your ministry, all of that is what comes with an Indigenous person as you're meeting them. That's all that's at play. Maybe at different focuses or emphasis at different times of their life, but that's all that's there. All those rights that were infringed upon, like, we carry that with us into our conversations. I know I got 5 minutes. I'm going to pack it all in. Just hang in there with me, please. So I was using my Friday afternoon. I went to this workshop on racism, of all things. So I wanted to hear what this Indigenous lady had to say about racism. And I learned something. She talked about racial stress. And some of the things that she gave examples of racial stress was anxiety, depression, self-blame, substance abuse, dietary disturbance, heart disease, hypertension, respiratory complications. So when I was thinking about that, what are we also hearing when you hear that? I hear George Floyd. I hear how he suffered from racial stress up until his last breath. And the thing is that these stress examples could describe any members of my family as well. Not only that, but I learned that racial stress has a cycle. So the racial stress leads to poor mental health and physical health. This causes your body to break down, pushes people to cope in unhealthy ways. In my case, my mom suffered lots by alcoholism and gambling, and different family members have different substance abuse. And then, and it's not, this kind of discrimination I talk about is just not any form of stress. It's a type of stress that disproportionately affects minorities. So then you have people at a social disadvantage are more likely to experience stress from racism, and then they're less likely to have the resources to extinguish this stress because they're at a social disadvantage. So you see the cycle that's happening. I see the cycle. Now I offer all the bad things. I offer Luke 10, verse 1 to 12. And I offer that because I love what it says. When you enter a house, first say peace to this house. And then it says, stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you. And it says, when you enter a town and are welcome, eat what is offered. Heal the sick who are there and tell them the kingdom of God has come near you. What doesn't it say? It doesn't say be rude, burn the house down, force your way, right? They talk about all the ways to be in fellowship. So my questions to you, and this is the end of before our breakout, is what will you change in your behavior, and what one piece of information will you keep to inform the ministry you choose to do? And then when we when we go back to question and answer, maybe you could share that with me and then ask your question.
Awesome. So you want us to spend a couple minutes, Shannon, with that personal piece. What will you change in your own behavior? And the other one was, what one piece of information will you take into your ministry?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've just posted those. I spelled ministry wrong, but have some grace, show mercy. Thank you for that, Shannon. We're really grateful for, well, yeah, I can say more later about what I'm grateful for. For now, I'm going to send us off into breakout rooms. We're going to have 10 minutes. What is there, 9 and 11 of us? Let's do three breakout rooms. And yeah, just take a minute to consider those two questions. They are in the chat. It's my understanding the chat will carry over to the breakout rooms. I hope I'm right about that. But if not, just remember you're thinking about something personally, and you're also thinking about something related to ministry. When we come back, we're going to take just a couple minutes to hear one or two things from each group, and then we're going to have time for questions. And Cam, thanks for that. We're going to miss you, but understand that you've got some commitments as well. So, so what does that leave us with? 10, that's okay. I'm still going to do 3 groups. So are you ready? Everyone clear? Here we go. I think we're all back. Yes, I think, yes. All's ashore who's coming ashore, I guess. I really appreciated our group time. I hope you did as well, although we didn't have near enough time in our group. Although we did have some good conversation, even though it was a little limited in terms of time. I let our groups go just a little bit longer. We have 12 to 15 minutes left, and I want the last minute to close. So we've got just 10 or 11 minutes. Would you rather have each group share one maybe thing that really struck them, or that you observed, or that you all resonated with? Or would you rather have this time to ask Shannon a couple questions? If you've got questions, why don't we begin there? Because I don't want you to leave without sort of pressing Shannon with some of those questions. If you don't, then we'll visit each group. Anyone have a question? I will thank Shannon at the end. So so save that and allow me to do that for us, so that we keep room for questions if we can. Yeah,
I have a question about land acknowledgements. It seems like a much more common thing in Canada. And so I'm here in Michigan right now. And so it's not on anyone's radar here. And I want to change that. But I don't necessarily know how to go about doing it.
That's thank you. I would love to see that happen more in the States. I think one way to understand land acknowledgements is that you got to think about what was taken away, right? And what was against the law to do. So any kind of ceremony or custom or culture was against the law, according to the Indian Act. And therefore part of this resurgence, if you might use, is part of reclaiming what was taken away, and also about showing respect to a custom that is coming back. So that's one way. It's also, I know I'm not telling you how to, I'm just giving you maybe some considerations.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's a way to go against the narrative that Indigenous people, you know, weren't here, that the land was empty, it was for the taking, like the doctrine of discovery but its doctrine is about this land was empty, the people here are not Christians, therefore are unworthy, therefore we could destroy them. But the territory acknowledgement places that relationship back to land. It changes the narrative. Indigenous people are here. They were stewards of this land, and it helps to, you know, done with sincerity, is a step in opening that kind of conversation back up, right? So if people are worried that if they do it, it's a checkpoint and, oh, I did my reconciliation work. But no, like if you share about why it's important to you, then it's not a check mark, and it could open up for a conversation as part of like a non-Indigenous person doing it.
Can
And I
I,
also just shared the territory acknowledgement guide in the chat, if you want to tell them about that.
So we did have a guide to help guide people into creating their own territory acknowledgement. So we encourage you to do some research about the land, about the history. We also encourage, when it's safe and we're not in a pandemic, like maybe even start up a conversation with Indigenous people in that area, you know, again, to get a more understanding from that point of view, right? So we don't want just a Google interpretation of the history of the land, right? But like a real relationship-based, reciprocal understanding of the land, that, you know, and then that builds that relationship up too. Mm-hmm. So we have that guide. It just gives you some examples and maybe a template to start with, and some of those considerations to work with Indigenous people on it.
Shannon, you and Cindy may be encouraged to know that I've heard land acknowledgements at the start of some CRC worship services now. So I don't know if they do that every week. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing not, although I could be wrong, but I've certainly heard it. And yeah, I think it's just part of awareness raising, right? It's, oh yeah, the land we're sitting on right now has been taken from somebody. And it's right. It's just a simple acknowledge, well, simple in the sense that the pronouncement itself is simple, but obviously very complex, raises a very complex story, and just opens conversation potentially.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Any questions? Leah, your group, what sort of came out of the conversation in your group that might be worth sharing with the others who weren't part of your group?
Well, I think we talked about, you know, Vivian has an, you know, experience living in Egypt, coming to Canada, and I'm from the States coming to Canada. And so I think we kind of settled on just the understanding that, like, there's so much we don't know or understand about the place that we live or that we've settled or that we to really fully live out our faith in Jesus, that you know, our scriptural understanding of creation doesn't just didn't start with, you know, simply the Israelites, that there was there, you know, that the Indigenous creation story and the way that the Holy Spirit was already here in Canada well before, you know, the Old Testament was formed, and that part of acknowledging God's omnipotence and omnipresence is a part of hearing how he was already present here in Canada.
Yeah, and that's the narrative too, that the doctrine of discovery, one of it is like God wasn't here before, like God, maybe the gospel of Jesus wasn't here yet, but the gospel of God was here, right? And unfortunately, the gospel of Jesus was brought with violence, right? Understanding that. Yeah,
and the need to recognize that, name that, and own that, I think, as especially in ministry, just to be able, I mean, the importance of naming the Christian compulsion, like part, you know, complicity and actual oppression as part of this, you know, colonialization is, I think, really helpful for reconciliation.
Yep.
Yeah, we really wrestled with that in our group too, that notion that you know, this is part of our story. We have to own it and come to terms with it. And yeah. Ryan, anything else from our group that you want to highlight? Something that stood out?
We covered a lot of territory in a short time. One of the things we talked about when it came to like what to do next, and Christy and Ben were really good in highlighting, was that like a lot of it is listening, is hearing more stories like Shannon's and learning. And we talked about, well, one of the things I mentioned was how much I appreciated the Luke 10 story and how that creates kind of this this template like for that. And so how it's like a passage that you can go back to, not just with this topic, but with lots of different issues that you encounter in ministry as well. But yeah, that was something that came out of the group that I'm definitely gonna take away.
Yeah, that's what I appreciated from the Luke 10. It didn't come with you have to be baptized, or you had to be of this thing first, or you had, like, it wasn't a condition. It was a fellowship relationship.
Yeah, it strikes me that Luke 10 model is about offering, not about forcing, right? Lynette,
and choice and autonomy, right?
Yes, absolutely. Lynette, any word from your group to share?
Yeah, we also talked about the history, where we've learned some of the history through the years, right, through our classes and whatnot, but we clearly don't know the whole history. So learning more and from a different perspective was really, and will be really beneficial as we do that more. We also mentioned the Luke 10 and just how, like, learning how to receive hospitality, not just give or not just force our way into things, but being on the receiving end is like, I think, a spiritual practice that our churches often lack. And I think one of the things that we found really beneficial in our group was, well, we had Shannon, which is great. Sorry for the rest of you. But we asked about resources. And so I actually would wonder if maybe Shannon could share a list, like a typed list of some of them afterwards, so that can be shared with the broader group, just for further reading or engagement as we move forwards in ministry or whatever else we're doing. Yeah.
Awesome segue, Lynette, because speaking of resources, Shannon, and I don't know, Cindy, maybe you've been working with Shannon on that. Yeah, Shannon's nodding. Shannon and Cindy have created a I think, a 4-session curriculum around this book called The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America. And they're going to be hosting a book study on that book, where there'll be opportunity, 4 sessions to come together and just dig a little deeper into some of the material from the book. So you'll be
Sean is
seeing,
a part of that too, you'll see.
and
He's one of the guest speakers.
You will see an invitation from me at some point when that's ready to be launched. I'll send an invitation. So that might be a way to further this as well. And I see someone has just posted, was that Cindy? Has just posted some more resources, a list of resources on that website. So
we have a hearts exchange too that goes deeper into the spiritual violence and syncretism and contextualization. We go into the history too a bit more deeper about that. So just when we talk about smudging and contextualization, we're hoping that this helps people to be less or more open-minded to how worship can be with an Indigenous identity.
That Indigenous identity, I shared with my group, Shannon, that the thing that struck me most personally today was just this notion that was presented, especially at residential school, but elsewhere in the culture as well, that you could be Indigenous or Christian, but you can't be an Indigenous Christian. And I said, that struck me afresh today. No one has ever said to me or implied, you can be British or Christian, but you can't be a British Christian.
Right.
That's my cultural background, and no one has ever implied that, suggested that. I've never even thought of that possibility, that I somehow have to lay my British heritage aside in order to be a Christian. It's a bizarre concept to me, but one that Indigenous people have lived with. Thank you so much for today, Shannon. Thank you, everyone. I know everyone's dealing with Zoom fatigue. And so for you to commit to be here today tells me that, just that you're taking your role as a leader in the church really, really seriously and pressed through that fatigue to be part of today. And so thank you for that. The conversation, as I said, when we started today is just beginning, right? Like in our group, when we got to that question of, so what does this mean now for us in ministry? We all just kind of sat there and went, right? Where do we begin? How do we make space for these kinds of conversations and encourage them? How do we acknowledge the people around us? So yeah, those are important issues for us to be thinking about. Shannon, just a quick question about the book study. When do you anticipate that beginning, roughly? Hopefully soon. She's responded already. Beautiful.
Yeah, we have we have a little bit of a hard copy. We have the videos edited. I think we're just looking at just the final touches, I think.
Excellent. And thanks for that input too, Lynette. That's an interesting thought. Yeah, to use Indigenous books as part of a sermon series.
Braiding sweetgrass is what we talked about.
Okay.
What was it? Can you say that again?
Yeah, braiding sweetgrass. It's so beautiful. Cindy has it right there. Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Okay. Interesting.
I can't say enough about that.
Will you guys join me and just extend an arm towards Shannon and towards Cindy? And let's just offer them a blessing in their work. Shannon and Cindy, may the Lord bless you and equip you in the important ministry that he's called you to. May he use you mightily in his kingdom and in the CRC specifically as you teach us and lead us to be a people of hospitality, to be a people of grace, and to be a people who honor those who have gone before us with thanksgiving for them. And so the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you today and always as you serve him. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for joining, everybody, and thank you, Shannon,
Thank you.
for leading us so ably. If you got your reactions, you can clap your hands, you can put up a thumbs up, and blessings all. And I look forward to connecting with you again sometime soon. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.